The rain came down in heavy sheets, drumming on the pavement as Zenilia walked through the empty streets. The sky was dark, and the wind howled through the trees, sending leaves scattering in every direction. It wasn't the best time for a walk, but Zenilia needed to clear her mind. She liked the sound of rain. It always had a calming effect on her. She pulled her hood tighter over her head and kept her pace steady, thinking about the day she had just wrapped up. As she passed an alleyway, something caught her attention. A soft whimper. At first she thought it was just the wind, but then she heard it again. It was faint, but there was no mistaking it. It was the sound of an animal in distress. Curious, Zenilia slowed down and looked toward the sound. At the edge of the alley, there was a storm drain, and she could hear the whimpering coming from below. Without a second thought, she walked over to the drain and crouched down. Peering inside, her eyes widened in surprise. There, trapped in the dark, cold storm drain, was a small puppy. Its fur was soaked, and it shivered uncontrollably. The puppy was stuck, unable to move. It looked up at Zenilia with big, pleading eyes. Zenilia's heart sank. She could see the fear and pain in the puppy's eyes. It was clear the poor thing had been there for a while, alone and cold. Her first instinct was to help. Without hesitation, she knelt down beside the drain and carefully reached in, trying to get a good grip on the small dog. The puppy whined as Zenilia gently pulled it from the drain, her hands shaking slightly from the cold. Once she had it in her arms, she wrapped it tightly in her jacket to keep it warm. The puppy sniffled, shivering more from the shock of being pulled from the drain than anything else. Zenilia held it close, trying to calm it. "Hey there, little guy," Zenilia whispered softly. "You're okay now. I've got you." The puppy looked up at her, still trembling. Its fur was matted, and it was clear that it had been through a lot. Zenilia's heart melted at the sight of the small, helpless creature in her arms. She could see it was exhausted, probably from the cold, hunger, and fear it had endured. She glanced around, thinking about what to do next. She couldn't leave the puppy here, especially not in this storm. Without a second thought, she decided to take it with her. She looked back down at the puppy, and with a gentle smile she said, "You're coming with me, okay?" The puppy let out a soft, quiet whimper and licked Zenilia's face, as if thanking her. She smiled again, feeling a strange sense of connection. She wasn't sure why, but she felt an instant bond with the little creature. She carefully cradled the puppy in her arms and walked back to her car, shielding it from the rain as much as she could. She opened the passenger door and placed the puppy in the seat, making sure it was comfortable. Then Zenilia climbed into the driver's seat, started the car, and began her drive. As the car pulled away, Zenilia glanced over at the puppy. It was still shivering, but it seemed a little calmer now that it was in a safe place. She took a deep breath, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She couldn't believe how easily she'd made the decision to take the puppy with her. It just felt right. But as she drove, she noticed something strange. The puppy, though calm now, seemed to be looking around as if it knew exactly where it was going. It wasn't just huddling in fear like she'd expected. It was alert, eyes darting back and forth, as if it was on some kind of mission. Zenilia frowned. She had rescued animals before, but nothing quite like this. The puppy's strange behavior intrigued her. It was as though it wasn't just a lost, frightened animal. It was something more. After a few minutes of driving, Zenilia decided to pull over at a nearby gas station. She needed to make sure the puppy was okay and get it some water. When she opened the car door, the puppy jumped from its seat and quickly ran toward the back of the car. Zenilia was taken aback by how quickly it moved. "Hey, slow down," she called out, following the puppy. But the puppy didn't slow down. Instead, it darted into the parking lot, running toward an alley behind the gas station. Zenilia's curiosity piqued. She followed it, wondering what the little dog was up to. The puppy stopped at a narrow space between two buildings. It sniffed the air, its ears twitching as if it had found something. Zenilia stood behind it, watching closely. What was it doing? The puppy suddenly darted forward, slipping through a small gap in the wall. Zenilia was caught off guard. She rushed toward the gap, but it was too small for her to fit through. She crouched down and peeked through the opening, but she couldn't see much. The puppy, however, seemed to have no trouble at all. It was gone. "What the?" Zenilia muttered under her breath, bewildered. She felt a mix of concern and fascination. What was going on? Zenilia was about to turn back when she noticed something strange. The gap in the wall wasn't just a random opening. It looked deliberate. Something was off about this whole situation. And that's when she realized something important. The puppy wasn't just lost. It was leading her somewhere. She stood up straight, her mind racing. The puppy wasn't just a stray animal. It was part of something bigger, something she didn't yet understand. As Zenelia turned back toward the car, a strange sense of anticipation filled the air. The puppy had something in mind, and she was going to follow it. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a much bigger adventure than she ever expected. Zenelia didn't quite know what to make of the puppy's strange behavior. As she sat back in the car, she glanced over at it. The little dog was now curled up in the passenger seat, still wet, but now visibly calmer. It no longer seemed scared, but something about its posture, its alertness, still puzzled her. It wasn't the typical frightened stray she expected to find on a stormy night. This puppy had a purpose. Zenelia shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She drove on, heading back to her apartment. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the puppy's movements weren't random. It had acted with intention, and Zenelia couldn't ignore the sense of urgency that had taken over it once she found it. She pulled into the parking garage and parked her car. The puppy, still quiet, looked at her with a mix of curiosity and something else, something that felt oddly knowing. Zenelia sighed, grabbing her bag before turning toward the little dog. "All right, let's get you inside and cleaned up." But the moment she opened the car door, the puppy didn't just jump out or stay put like she expected. Instead, it darted past her legs and sprinted toward the elevator doors, as if it knew exactly where to go. "Whoa," Zenelia exclaimed. She quickly followed, puzzled by the puppy's sudden burst of energy. The puppy pressed its little paws against the elevator button, then stood still as if it was waiting for Zenelia to catch up. "Are you trying to tell me something?" she said, chuckling despite herself. She shook her head, pressing the button again to call the elevator. "All right, let's see where you're taking us." The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and the puppy jumped inside, standing patiently as Zenelia followed. It was almost like the puppy had a routine, like it had done this before. Zenelia couldn't help but laugh. "You've got your own little agenda, don't you?" As the elevator doors closed, the puppy stared up at her with a focused intensity. Zenelia shook her head again, feeling a mix of amusement and concern. What was happening? Why was this little puppy acting so differently? The elevator dinged again, and the doors slid open. As they stepped into her apartment, Zenelia set her bag down on the table, then turned to face the puppy. It was now wagging its tail, its eyes bright with a mix of excitement and purpose. "All right," Zenelia said slowly, kneeling down to the puppy. "Let's get you cleaned up." She gently dried it off with a towel, but her mind was racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that this puppy was leading her somewhere, or maybe even running from something. She had no idea what she had gotten herself into, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary stray dog. Underscore 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 underscore. The night was still young, but Zenelia's mind was buzzing with thoughts about the puppy. It was starting to get late, and she was beginning to feel the weight of exhaustion creep in. She needed rest, but the puppy had other ideas. She had given it a warm bath, fed it some food, and even found an old blanket to let it curl up on in the corner of her living room. But despite all of that, the puppy seemed restless, constantly pacing back and forth. Every now and then, it would stop and stare at the door, its ears perked up as if waiting for something to happen. Zenelia sat on the couch, watching the puppy, her thoughts racing. It wasn't just the puppy's unusual behavior that concerned her. It was the strange feeling she got every time it looked at her. The little dog wasn't acting like a frightened stray. It was like it knew something she didn't, and was trying to communicate it. "Okay, what's going on with you?" Zenelia muttered to herself. "Why do you keep looking at the door like that?" It was then that the puppy suddenly stopped pacing and sat down, its body tense. It stared intently at the door, its eyes wide and alert. Zenelia's heart skipped a beat. What was it waiting for? Just as she was about to get up and investigate, the sound of a loud bang echoed from outside the apartment. The puppy immediately jumped to its feet, barking frantically. It ran toward the door, pawing at it like it wanted to get out. "Hey, wait," Zenelia shouted, but the puppy wasn't listening. It was as if the noise triggered something in it, a primal instinct to flee. With a sense of urgency, Zenelia rushed to the door, grabbing the puppy before it could dart outside. She turned the lock and pulled the door open just a crack to see what was going on. From the hallway, she could hear voices, low, angry murmurs. The puppy whimpered, tugging on Zenelia's sleeve, urging her to get away from the door. "What is going on?" Zenelia whispered to herself. She closed the door again, but the puppy was still frantic, pacing back and forth. It seemed to sense that danger was near. Zenilia backed away from the door, her eyes flicking toward the windows. She tried to peer out but couldn't see much in the dim light. The puppy's behavior was starting to make more sense. It wasn't just scared, it was trying to protect her. And now it seemed like someone was outside, possibly looking for the little dog. Her heart raced. She had no idea who these people were or what they wanted. But one thing was clear, she had to act fast. The puppy looked up at her, its eyes locked onto hers. In that moment, Zenilia understood. She wasn't just looking after a stray animal. She was in the middle of something bigger, something she didn't fully comprehend yet. And whatever was happening, the puppy was her guide. Without a word, she grabbed her keys, tossed them in her bag, and scooped the puppy into her arms. As she made her way toward the back door, she heard a louder noise from the hallway, a door slamming open. There was no time to waste. Zenilia bolted for the back exit, pushing open the door as quietly as possible. The puppy squirmed in her arms, but Zenilia held it close, her mind set on escaping. Whatever this puppy was running from, Zenilia knew she had just become a part of it. Zenilia's heart pounded as she rushed through the back door of her apartment, cradling the frantic puppy in her arms. She moved swiftly, trying to stay as quiet as possible while avoiding the front hallway where she'd heard voices just moments before. The puppy was squirming, its paws twitching nervously as it barked low and urgently, clearly feeling the tension in the air. "Shh, it's okay," Zenilia whispered, glancing over her shoulder. She could hear footsteps now, loud, deliberate. Someone was searching for her. She took a sharp turn into the alley behind the building, walking quickly but cautiously. The puppy's little body was trembling in her arms, but it still seemed to be on high alert, ears pointed forward. It wasn't like a typical scared dog. This one was focused, almost as if it knew exactly where to go. Zenilia didn't have time to second-guess herself. She could hear voices getting closer, the distinct sound of footsteps following her every move. There was no way she was going back inside. She had to keep moving. She didn't know how the puppy had known to lead her to this back alley, but she trusted it. It wasn't long before the little dog started to struggle in her arms again. Looking down at it, she saw it wasn't just restless. It was pulling her in a specific direction. "What is it?" Zenilia muttered, as if the puppy could answer. She glanced around and realized they were nearing a part of the alley where the buildings seemed to crowd together. A small, almost hidden door was tucked between two rundown walls. She hadn't noticed it before, but the puppy had. Without hesitation, the puppy squirmed free from Zenilia's arms, landing on the ground and darting toward the door. It stopped right in front of it, looking up at her expectantly. Zenilia stood frozen for a moment, unsure what to do. The sounds of footsteps were getting louder now, and she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. With a deep breath, she crouched down, pushing the door open. It creaked loudly, but the puppy, completely unbothered, slipped through the gap as though it had done this countless times before. "Wait for me," Zenilia called softly, following the puppy inside. The space behind the door was cramped and dark, but as soon as Zenilia stepped through, she could feel the temperature drop. The walls were concrete, and the air had a damp, musty smell. She couldn't see much, but the faint glow of a single light bulb in the far corner of the room illuminated the space enough for her to move. The puppy, once again, was already ahead of her, moving with a purposeful speed. It was as if the little dog knew exactly where it was going, and Zenilia was simply tagging along. The floor beneath her feet was uneven, and the deeper she went, the more she realized she was in some kind of hidden underground area. It was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and doorways, each looking more mysterious than the last. The puppy didn't pause, continuing down the hall with determination. Zenilia felt an odd sense of calm despite the strange circumstances, almost as though she were following an invisible map. They passed a few rooms, each filled with strange equipment, some wires, some screens, but nothing that made sense. The further they went, the more her confusion grew. This wasn't just a random hidden room, it was something more. But the puppy wasn't distracted by the surroundings. It kept moving forward, darting around corners and glancing back at Zenilia to make sure she was still following. She did her best to keep up, even as she felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. As they reached the end of another hallway, the puppy stopped at a door. It was locked, but there was a keypad next to it. Without hesitation, the puppy's paws moved swiftly, tapping at the number pad. Zenilia watched in disbelief as it pawed at a few buttons, its nose brushing against the keys. The lock clicked, and the door slowly creaked open. Zenilia's mouth fell open. "Did you just?" The puppy didn't answer, of course. It just turned and trotted inside, looking back at Zenilia, urging her to follow. Her mind raced, and she felt a mix of awe and confusion. There was no way this puppy should be able to do that. No way it should be able to open doors or work a keypad. Yet here she was, following it into the unknown. Underscore 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 underscore. The door led them into another room, this one even stranger than the last. It was dimly lit by a series of blinking monitors, each showing random data on various screens. Some of the screens displayed street maps, others showed pictures of different places, and a few even flashed images of people she didn't recognize. The whole room felt like a mix of an office and a high-tech command center. The puppy, unbothered by the strange environment, trotted over to a desk in the corner, its little paws tapping at the buttons of a nearby console. Zenilia approached cautiously, glancing around at the equipment, unsure of what it all meant. She knelt down beside the puppy, who was now pawing at a set of blueprints that were spread out on the desk. The documents looked official, but they were covered in symbols and numbers she didn't understand. Her gaze flicked between the puppy and the blueprints, trying to piece together what was happening. "What is all this?" she muttered, mostly to herself. The puppy barked softly, jumping up onto the desk and nudging the corner of one of the blueprints with its nose. There was something about the way it was acting, as if it was trying to tell her something important. Zenilia hesitated, then carefully picked up the paper the puppy had pointed to. Her fingers grazed over the printed lines and symbols, and as she looked closer, she realized something shocking. The map on the blueprint was of the city, the exact area she had just been walking through. But there were also other areas marked in red, some of them places she had never seen before. It was like someone had been mapping out every corner of the city. "What is this?" she whispered. The puppy barked again, snapping her out of her thoughts. It jumped off the desk and scampered toward a corner of the room where another strange door was hidden. It looked just like the one they had entered from, but this one was far more secure. Without missing a beat, the puppy padded over to the door and began pawing at it, clearly intent on opening it. Zenilia followed, and as the little dog nudged a hidden lever at the side, she heard the click of a lock disengaging. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway leading further down. Zenilia swallowed hard. The puppy had clearly led her to this place for a reason, and she couldn't back out now. What lay ahead was a mystery, but she had no choice but to follow. The puppy darted through the door, tail wagging. Zenilia took one last glance at the strange, dimly lit room and stepped forward into the unknown. The narrow hallway led them deeper into the unknown. Zenilia followed the puppy down the dim-lit corridor, her footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. The air grew colder as they moved further away from the door, and the faint hum of electronics seemed to grow louder with every step. The puppy darted ahead, its small paws clicking against the hard floor as it effortlessly navigated the winding path. Zenilia could hardly keep up with its speed, but she followed closely, trying to stay calm despite the growing tension in her chest. The puppy seemed to know exactly where it was going, and she was beginning to realize it wasn't just a random animal. It was leading her somewhere important. After what felt like an eternity of twisting passageways, they finally reached another door. This one was larger, metal, and covered in scratches, as if it had seen years of use. The puppy stopped in front of it, staring up at Zenilia with an expectant look, its tail wagging slightly. "Are we here?" Zenilia whispered to herself. She reached out for the handle, turning it slowly, and the door creaked open. Inside, the room was like nothing she had ever seen before. The walls were lined with rows of shelves filled with books, papers, and various electronic devices. There were multiple monitors flashing different screens of data, each displaying information she couldn't make sense of. The hum of machinery filled the air, mixing with the faint sound of typing from somewhere in the distance. The room was alive with activity, though it seemed deserted. Zenilia's eyes darted from one corner to the next, taking in the strange, high-tech setup. The puppy, meanwhile, trotted into the room without hesitation, its eyes scanning the space as if it had been here before. It moved toward a desk in the far corner, where several pieces of paper were spread out in disarray. Zenilia walked in slowly, her mind racing with questions. What was this place? Who had built this underground network? And why had the puppy brought her here? She walked over to the desk, peering at the papers, which were filled with blueprints and maps similar to the ones she had seen before. But now they were more detailed: charts, graphs, and diagrams scattered across the papers. She could make out the same red marks from earlier, only now there were more locations highlighted, more dots on the maps. As she looked at the desk, she noticed a large monitor in the corner flashing with new data. It looked like a live feed of street corners, buildings, and locations throughout the city, places she recognized. Something was off about all of this, and the puppy, acting as though it was comfortable here, clearly understood something she didn't. It hopped onto the desk, pawing at the monitor's screen as if trying to get her attention. "Is this what you wanted me to see?" Zenelia asked aloud, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to the puppy or to herself. The monitor blinked again, and suddenly, an image appeared, a detailed map of the city, overlaid with various moving dots. At the center of the map was a flashing red circle. The puppy barked once, sharply, and then jumped down from the desk, running toward another room at the back of the lab. Zenelia hesitated for a moment, but the urgency in the puppy's eyes pushed her forward. She followed it into the next room, which was much darker than the first. The lights flickered as she stepped inside, and she could barely make out the shapes of more shelves, crates, and machinery. The puppy wasn't stopping. It seemed to know exactly where it was going, leading her deeper into the labyrinthine network of underground rooms. They turned a corner and entered a smaller chamber, and that's when Zenelia noticed something strange. There on the wall was a huge screen displaying live footage of various places in the city. The footage looked eerily familiar, like it was surveillance footage. Her eyes widened as the camera focused on a street corner, her street corner. She saw herself standing outside the very building she had just left. The footage showed her walking through the alley, carrying the puppy in her arms, moving with haste. Suddenly, the puppy jumped up on a nearby table, knocking over a stack of papers. Zenelia was startled, and in that moment, she realized what she was seeing. The footage wasn't just about tracking her, it was tracking everything. She stepped back, her thoughts racing. The city was being monitored, but for what purpose? Underscore 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 underscore. As Zenelia stared at the monitors, trying to comprehend what was happening, the puppy suddenly barked again, drawing her attention. She turned toward it, noticing the urgency in its posture. It wasn't just the dog's behavior that caught her off guard, it was what was happening on the screen next to her. The footage had shifted. Now it was showing an image of the very room she was in, an overhead shot of the underground lab where she stood. Zenelia froze, realizing that whoever was controlling these cameras knew exactly where she was. They had been watching her. Before she could fully process the information, the puppy darted toward a different part of the room, its small paws skittering across the floor. It stopped in front of another desk, where a stack of folders and files was spread out. She walked over to the puppy, her heart pounding in her chest. It was as if the little dog had a purpose, and she was starting to believe that she wasn't just along for the ride. She was part of something bigger. The puppy's instinct, its actions, and the strange way it was leading her through the rooms made it clear. This wasn't random. This was planned. As she reached the desk, the puppy nudged one of the folders toward her. She picked it up, flipping it open. Inside was a set of documents with more detailed information about the locations, including some names that seemed familiar. Names of people in power. People she knew but never thought would be involved in something like this. One name stood out, Dr. Amelia Hartwell. The name was followed by a list of high-profile figures and key locations. As Zenelia scanned through the folder, she started to piece things together. The puppy wasn't just a stray, it was part of a much larger operation, one that had been monitoring certain individuals for a long time. The maps, the surveillance footage, and now these names, she was beginning to see a connection. This underground network was more than just a place of high-tech equipment. It was a hub for something far more sinister. The puppy, seemingly satisfied with the information Zenelia had uncovered, jumped up and pawed at another door in the far corner of the room. She could hear the sound of something locking inside, and the door slowly creaked open. It was clear now, this wasn't just an underground lab, it was a starting point. And Zenelia, whether she was ready or not, was being drawn into something much bigger than she ever imagined. Zenelia stood frozen in the doorway, her hands still resting on the stack of papers she had just discovered. The walls of the underground lab, with their glowing monitors and stacks of files, seemed to close in on her. She felt a rush of panic. She had stumbled into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. Whoever was behind this operation had been watching her since she found the puppy. They knew where she was now, and if they were monitoring her, they were surely monitoring the puppy too. The small dog, meanwhile, was calm as ever. It trotted toward the door in the corner of the room and stopped, glancing back at Zenilia with a quiet but expectant look in its eyes. "Come on," Zenilia muttered, her voice shaky, as if the puppy was the only thing keeping her grounded right now. "We got to get out of here." She took one last glance at the room, the reality of the situation hitting her with full force. This wasn't just about finding a stray puppy. It was about uncovering something massive. There was no telling how deep this went or who was behind it. But one thing was clear, they knew she was here. As Zenilia cautiously approached the door, she heard a soft beep, like the sound of a timer counting down. Her heart skipped a beat. It was coming from one of the monitors in the corner of the room. The countdown was on. The puppy's ears perked up, its little tail stiffening as it ran over to the desk, pawing at the monitor screen. Zenilia rushed over and peered at the display. It was a red flashing number, 0347. It was counting down. "Wait, what is this?" she said, panic rising in her chest. "What does this mean?" Without thinking, she grabbed the puppy and bolted for the door. The countdown ticked away rapidly as she ran through the hallway, her feet pounding against the concrete floor. She glanced back. The puppy had led her this far. If it had a plan, she hoped it had a way out. But as she reached the door at the end of the hall, it didn't open. She tugged on the handle, her panic rising. "Come on," she hissed under her breath. Suddenly, the puppy barked, its voice high-pitched and sharp. It jumped up to the side of the door, pawing at something near the wall. Zenilia knelt down, watching as the dog's paw hit a hidden button on the wall. The door clicked, the lock disengaged, and Zenilia yanked it open. The sound of the timer still echoed in her ears as they rushed out of the room. As soon as the door closed behind them, the puppy looked up at her with wide, focused eyes. "We're not out of the woods yet," Zenilia said, panting as they sprinted down another dark corridor. The puppy barked again, more forcefully this time, and immediately ran ahead, its small paws flying over the floor. Zenilia followed, not bothering to question how the dog seemed to know exactly where to go. It was as if it had memorized the layout of this place. They reached a narrow staircase, leading up to another door at the top. Zenilia's breath caught in her throat as they ascended the steps. She had no idea what was waiting for them up there. But the puppy wasn't hesitating. It was already at the door, pawing at the handle. "Let's go," Zenilia whispered to the puppy, more to steady herself than anything else. With a creak, the door swung open, revealing a narrow alleyway outside. The sound of the rain was heavy against the pavement, but it was the familiar feeling of fresh air that made Zenilia breathe a sigh of relief. They were out, but not free. Looking over her shoulder, she half expected to see a team of armed guards chasing them down, but there was no sign of anyone. "Where to now?" Zenilia muttered, looking down at the puppy. The dog seemed calm now, like it was relieved to be outside, yet it was still acting with purpose. Without warning, the puppy darted ahead again, running toward the street. Zenilia could only guess what its plan was, but she didn't have time to second-guess. She took off after it, hoping that wherever they were headed, they were one step ahead of whoever was after them. Underscore 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 underscore. The night air was cold as Zenilia and the puppy raced through the rain-soaked streets. The puppy, moving with determination, led the way, its small legs carrying it at a speed that was almost impossible for Zenilia to keep up with. But she pushed forward, running as fast as she could, every breath shallow with the fear that whoever was behind them might catch up. She glanced over her shoulder once, and her stomach churned. The underground lab might have been behind them, but the real danger was just beginning. There was no way they were safe yet. Whoever had been tracking them would stop at nothing to get the puppy back. As Zenilia rounded a corner, she spotted headlights coming from down the street. Her heart skipped. She froze for a moment, trying to assess if they had been spotted. The headlights grew brighter, and it was then she realized that a car was coming directly toward her. The puppy barked suddenly, stopping in its tracks and looking back at Zenilia as if it was warning her. "Get down," Zenilia shouted, diving to the side of the street as the car sped by. It wasn't slowing down. She barely avoided getting hit, and as the car screeched to a halt, The door swung open. Two men in dark clothing jumped out, their eyes scanning the street. Zenilia could feel her heart thundering in her chest. The chase had begun. "Go," she shouted, her voice shaking as she grabbed the puppy and ran for cover. She dashed into an alley, her mind racing for a plan, but there was no time to think. She just had to keep moving. The puppy, still determined, darted ahead. Zenilia followed, adrenaline pumping through her veins. The men behind them weren't far off. She could hear their footsteps pounding on the wet pavement as they chased her through the city streets. They turned another corner, and Zenilia found herself in a darker part of the city. The alleyways were narrow, and the rain had made everything slick and dangerous. She could barely see through the water dripping down her face. She turned to look at the puppy. It was still going, still pushing ahead with that same focus. It seemed like the little dog had some kind of destination in mind, and Zenilia was trusting it. She had no choice. Another turn, and the puppy stopped in front of a rusty old door. Without hesitation, it squeezed through the narrow gap at the bottom, vanishing inside. Zenilia didn't think twice. She dropped to her knees, crawled through, and emerged into a hidden courtyard. She turned back to look. There was no sign of the men. For a moment, Zenilia breathed a sigh of relief, but the puppy was already moving again, leading her deeper into the hidden streets. It wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. Zenilia and the puppy ran further into the hidden streets, moving through alleyways and narrow paths that seemed to disappear into the night. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the only sounds now were the echo of their footsteps and the soft panting of the puppy as it led her through the maze of back streets. Zenilia's legs were aching from the constant movement, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not now. The puppy, though small, was relentless. It had already covered so much ground, and its pace showed no sign of slowing. Zenilia had to keep up. There was something guiding the little dog, an instinct that seemed too perfect to be accidental. It wasn't just running for its life, it was leading them somewhere. After several more turns, the puppy skidded to a stop in front of a rusted metal gate. It was the kind of gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, covered in grime and old, chipped paint. The puppy barked sharply, its ears pointed forward, eyes scanning the surroundings as though it was waiting for something. Zenilia's chest tightened. This was it. They had reached some kind of destination, but what exactly were they walking into? A low rumbling noise echoed in the distance. She turned, startled by the sound of an approaching vehicle. The last thing she wanted was to be caught, but they couldn't stay here much longer. Without thinking, she pushed against the gate, feeling it creak and groan as it slowly gave way. The puppy darted through the opening, and Zenilia followed, barely squeezing through before the gate slammed shut behind her. The alley they found themselves in was even darker than the last, but it felt different. It was quieter. The kind of quiet that made Zenilia uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for them. She glanced at the puppy, who was now standing still, staring ahead. It didn't bark or whimper. It just watched, its eyes focused on something in the distance. Zenilia's instincts told her to keep moving, but she felt like they had reached the point of no return. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being cornered. Just then, the sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Several shadows emerged from the other end of the alley, men in dark clothing, their faces hidden by the night. Zenilia's heart raced. The chase had come to a head. The first man stepped forward, his hand reaching into his jacket, pulling out a small device. He pressed a button, and a bright light flickered on above them, revealing their faces. She could see now that they weren't just random thugs. They were professionals. The way they moved, their eyes scanning the surroundings, it was clear they were part of something far bigger. The puppy let out a low growl, its posture tense. It was ready to fight, but Zenilia knew they couldn't win this by force. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension. She wasn't about to let them intimidate her. One of the men smirked. "We want the dog. It's that simple." Zenilia's grip on the puppy tightened. "Not a chance." "You don't understand," the man said, his tone turning colder. "The dog is part of something much bigger than you realize. It has information we need, and you've made a mistake by getting involved." Before she could respond, the puppy suddenly lunged forward, darting between Zenilia's legs and charging toward the men. The man who had spoken raised his hand, but the puppy was too quick. It dodged, using its agility to weave between the men, and then, in an instant, it leaped up, knocking the small device from the man's hand. The device clattered to the ground, and the light above them flickered, plunging them back into darkness. The puppy yelped and ran back towards Zenilia, who immediately grabbed it and backed away. The men, now momentarily disoriented, scrambled to retrieve the device. Zenelia, seizing the opportunity, dashed toward a nearby set of stairs leading to the rooftops. She heard the men shout behind her, but she didn't stop. She had to get away. The puppy barked from her arms, urging her on. She didn't know how much longer they had before the men caught up, but she couldn't risk being trapped. As they reached the top of the building, Zenelia paused to catch her breath. She looked around. She was now on a rooftop, overlooking the entire city. But the view did little to calm her nerves. In fact, it only reminded her of how small she was compared to the operation she had stumbled into. But the puppy, whatever it was, had saved them for now, and Zenelia knew she had to keep running. Underscore 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 underscore. Just as Zenelia began to climb down from the rooftop, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Her heart dropped. They weren't just after her anymore. They were after the puppy. The whole city seemed to be in on the hunt. But as she turned back to look at the puppy, she noticed something different. The little dog, which had been so frantic and fearful before, now looked calm, almost at peace. It was as though it had accomplished its mission. It didn't seem afraid anymore. Instead, it seemed confident. Zenelia frowned. What had changed? Before she could fully process the thought, the puppy jumped down from her arms and ran to the edge of the rooftop. It stood still for a moment, as if surveying the area, and then looked back at her, its eyes gleaming with something that could only be described as purpose. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and Zenelia knew she had to make a decision. Run again, or trust the puppy? She watched as the puppy took off, moving swiftly and purposefully across the rooftops, dodging shadows and jumping over gaps in the buildings. It was moving with an energy she hadn't seen before. Without a second thought, Zenelia followed, her adrenaline kicking back in. She ran after the puppy, who led her through the maze of rooftops, jumping and weaving in ways she couldn't have predicted. As they approached a large abandoned building at the far end of the city, the puppy stopped again, looking back at Zenelia. For the first time, Zenelia felt like she was being led somewhere important. And as she reached the top of the final building, she realized the truth. The puppy had been guiding her all along, not just to safety, but to uncover something much bigger. This wasn't a simple chase. It was part of something far greater, and now Zenelia was a part of it too. Zenelia stood at the edge of the rooftop, the night sky stretched out before her, but her mind was racing with thoughts of what was happening. The city stretched out beneath her like a maze of lights, streets, and shadows, but right now she couldn't focus on any of it. Her eyes were fixed on the puppy, who had just leaped to the next rooftop without hesitation. "Wait for me," she shouted, almost out of breath. But the puppy wasn't slowing down. It kept moving with purpose, bounding effortlessly across the rooftops as if it had done this countless times before. The sight made her hesitate for only a moment, but then her instincts kicked in. She had no choice but to follow. Without looking back, Zenelia took off after the puppy, moving faster than she thought she could. Her heart raced, adrenaline pumping through her veins. The sounds of sirens echoed from below, and her mind flashed back to the men who had been chasing her. She couldn't afford to stop, not even for a second. The rooftop they were on was old and gritty, covered in moss and patches of grime, but that didn't matter now. The only thing that mattered was getting away from the danger that had followed her. She could still hear the distant screech of tires and the hum of engines. Their pursuers were close. The puppy had already reached the far edge of the building, crouching down low and scanning the street below. It seemed calm, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. Zenelia, now just a few feet behind, caught her breath and followed the little dog's gaze. Across the alley, a large truck sat parked, its headlights dimming. It looked like an old delivery vehicle, its rusted exterior blending into the shadows. The puppy looked back at Zenelia, eyes bright and focused. There was no time to think, no time for second-guessing. Zenelia stepped up beside it, her heart beat loud in her ears. The truck was their only way out, if they could make it to it in time. The sound of engines grew louder. The men were gaining. She could feel the pressure building, the urgency of the moment pushing her forward. Without warning, the puppy took off again, its legs moving in a blur. It dashed toward the edge of the rooftop, and Zenelia barely had time to react. She pushed off the ground, leaping after the dog. For a second, she felt the air rush by her, her body weightless as she flew over the gap between the buildings. The landing was rough, and Zenelia stumbled slightly. But she caught herself just in time, crouching low as she landed on the narrow fire escape of the adjacent building. The puppy had already made its way down, jumping to the ground below without hesitation. "Wait up!" Zenelia gasped, but she couldn't stop now. She had to keep up. As she descended the metal ladder of the fire escape, she could hear footsteps above, the sound of their pursuers echoing from the rooftop. It was only a matter of time before they realized where she had gone. The puppy was waiting below, its eyes locked on the alley ahead. It wasn't running, but it was clear that it wasn't done yet. The truck was still in view, but it was moving. It was starting to pull away from the curb. Zenelia's heart skipped a beat. The vehicle was about to leave. In a flash, the puppy bolted forward, running with everything it had. Zenelia followed close behind, her feet pounding against the wet pavement as she pushed herself harder. The truck was almost out of reach, its engine rumbling as it made a turn, preparing to speed off. Come on, Zenelia muttered, her pulse racing. She could see the truck's tail lights flickering, growing fainter by the second. The puppy wasn't giving up. With one final burst of speed, it leaped toward the back of the truck. Zenelia saw it just in time. Without thinking, she sprinted forward, grabbing onto the rear bumper of the vehicle as the puppy scampered onto the back. The truck lurched forward, picking up speed. Zenelia struggled to keep her grip, her fingers aching as she held on. She couldn't let go. If she did, she knew she'd be left behind. The truck picked up speed as it drove through the streets, weaving in and out of traffic. Zenelia pulled herself up onto the back, using the last of her strength to climb into the cargo area. The puppy was already there, looking up at her as if waiting for her to join it. She breathed a sigh of relief as she pulled herself inside, the noise of the city fading behind her. For the first time since the chase had begun, she felt like they were finally escaping. The truck rumbled on, taking them further away from the danger, but Zenelia knew it wouldn't be for long. The people after the puppy wouldn't give up that easily. But for now they had a moment of peace. Zenelia looked down at the little dog beside her, its eyes bright and calm. The puppy had led her through every twist and turn, guiding her when she didn't know where to go. It had saved her countless times, and now it was her turn to protect it. The road ahead was uncertain, and she had no idea where they were heading. But for the first time in a long while, Zenelia felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone anymore, and with the puppy by her side, maybe, just maybe, they could outrun whatever was coming next. The rumbling of the truck slowly faded into the background as Zenelia sat on the cold, metal floor of the cargo area. The puppy, still alert but calm, sat beside her, watching the road through the small cracks in the truck's rear doors. Every now and then, it would glance up at her, as if checking to make sure she was okay. Zenelia ran a hand through her damp hair and leaned against the side of the truck, trying to steady her breath. Her heart was still pounding from the chase. They had barely made it. But as the truck picked up speed, heading into darker parts of the city, Zenelia felt an uneasy stillness settle in. There was a sense of temporary safety, but she knew it wasn't over. The men who had been chasing them were still out there. They weren't going to give up that easily. And then there was the bigger question. Who were they? Who were these people behind the puppy, and why had they been tracking it, and now her for so long? She glanced down at the puppy, still sitting by her side, its eyes bright and focused. There was something in those eyes, something beyond the innocent look of a stray. The dog was smart, far too smart for its size, and its movements had been so deliberate, so purposeful, that it was clear it wasn't just trying to survive. It was guiding her, leading her on some kind of mission, like it knew exactly what it was doing. "What's going on?" Zenelia whispered, half to the puppy, half to herself. "What is all of this?" The puppy, as if understanding her thoughts, sat up and moved closer, pressing its small head against her leg. Zenelia reached down, absent-mindedly stroking its fur, but her mind was still racing. The events of the last few hours kept replaying in her mind. The storm drain, the underground lab, the men in dark clothing. It was all connected, and the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. As the truck continued down the road, Zenelia felt her eyelids grow heavy. The adrenaline that had kept her going for so long was starting to wear off, and the exhaustion was catching up. She fought to keep her focus, but her body felt like it was shutting down. She closed her eyes for just a moment, but before she could drift off to sleep, a loud thud came from the back of the truck. Zenelia snapped her eyes open, every muscle in her body tense. The truck swerved, a sudden sharp turn jarring her from her dazed state. The puppy immediately jumped to its feet, its ears perked up, and it began to bark urgently. "What is it?" Zenelia muttered, still groggy but instinctively standing. Her heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. The truck slowed and made another sharp turn. Zenelia grabbed onto a metal pole that ran along the side of the cargo hold to steady herself, her senses on high alert. The puppy was barking even more urgently now, pacing back and forth, looking toward the front of the truck as if it could sense the danger that was coming. Suddenly, the truck came to a screeching halt, and Zenelia was thrown forward, barely managing to catch herself. She looked through the small gap between the rear doors and saw headlights approaching rapidly. "No," she whispered, her heart racing as she realized they weren't alone anymore. Another vehicle had pulled up behind them. The unmistakable sound of a high-powered engine echoed in the distance, and Zenelia knew they were being pursued again. But this time, it was different. The truck's rear doors swung open, and Zenelia's heart nearly stopped. Standing in the doorway were two figures, their faces obscured by hoods and masks. One of them reached inside, grabbing the puppy in one swift motion. "No," Zenelia shouted, lunging toward the figures. But before she could reach them, the puppy was yanked out of her arms, and she was knocked backward into the truck. "Get down," one of the figures barked, his voice muffled but commanding. "You're coming with us." Zenelia struggled to her feet, her mind racing. They had the puppy. She couldn't let it happen, not after everything it had done for her. But the men were strong, and she was outmatched. Before she could make a move, the second figure grabbed her by the arm and yanked her toward the open door. She tried to fight back, but her body was still weak from the chase, and the truck's swaying motion made it difficult to balance. The figures shoved her out of the truck and onto the cold, wet ground. She staggered to her feet, only to find herself facing several armed men, their eyes cold and unblinking. "Stay down," one of them warned, raising a gun. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Zenelia froze. There was no way she was getting out of this on her own, not with these men surrounding her. But there was one thing she could do. She had to focus. She had to think fast. The puppy. It had to be important. They wouldn't be chasing it this hard if it wasn't. As she took a deep breath, her eyes flicked back toward the truck. The puppy was still there, held tightly by the first figure. It was barking, struggling in the man's grip, but it was clear it wasn't going down without a fight. The figures didn't seem to notice, and Zenelia made her move. She grabbed a metal rod from the ground and swung it at the man closest to her. The hit caught him off guard, knocking him to the side. She didn't wait for him to recover. She sprinted toward the puppy, pushing through the men who were too stunned to react quickly. "Hold on, I'm coming," Zenelia shouted, reaching the puppy just as it was about to be thrown into the back of the car. With one powerful shove, she pushed the figure away, knocking the puppy free. It scrambled onto the ground, looking up at her with those intelligent, focused eyes. But the second figure lunged at Zenelia, grabbing her from behind. She struggled, but the man was too strong, and she was starting to lose her grip. Suddenly, the puppy barked fiercely, running toward them. It jumped straight into the man's face, biting his hand and making him let go of Zenelia. She managed to break free, turning just in time to see the puppy knocking the man off balance. The men were disoriented now, and for the first time since this chase had begun, Zenelia felt a spark of hope. She grabbed the puppy and pulled it to her side, ready to fight her way out. But before she could make another move, a loud voice called from behind her. "Enough." A figure stepped out from the shadows, this time not masked. Dr. Amelia Hartwell. Zenelia's eyes widened in recognition, and the world seemed to stop. "Who are you?" Zenelia demanded, taking a step back. "What do you want with this dog?" Dr. Hartwell's face was calm, almost too calm, as she stared at Zenelia. "This dog," she began, her voice smooth, "is far more important than you realize. It's not just an animal. It's part of a larger project, a project you're now involved in whether you like it or not." Before Zenelia could respond, Dr. Hartwell continued, "The puppy, or rather, Subject 45, is the key to unlocking a network of information that could change everything. And you've been helping it escape without even knowing why. You're not just helping the puppy, you're helping us." Zenelia's mind was spinning, unable to process the full weight of Dr. Hartwell's words. But one thing was clear. This was bigger than she ever imagined. She glanced down at the puppy, whose eyes locked with hers, as if telling her this was only the beginning.